3, 4. Hello. Good, thanks. I'll do a brief intro if we can go 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll just take these two away. Right, so let's just chuck them down there. Hello, how are you? Thanks very much for being here. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. Right, I'll just do a brief intro and then... Okay, so our next panel, what? Oh, here we are. Nelly will introduce, keeping in theme of the marvelous document, and thank you for that, Peter Herbst, about the wonderful endorsement of the M20. It is a really good thing. If you want to read more on it, you go media20.org and you'll find the Joburg Declaration. It's there, and it is as cool as Peter was making it out to be. But in doing the work on the M20, we realized that there were a lot of people that didn't know enough about what the G20 was, or what the G20 does, or how it works, or why, or if it matters, and what the kind of key issues are. And so we assembled a marvelous panel to unpack those issues, and I'm going to hand over to them to introduce. There you are.
Okay, which mic am I using? Okay. I want to switch this one off because this one is on. Oh, thanks. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session. As William has just said, today we're unpacking the G20, what's really at stake, and why should you care? So my name is Nelly Ndimande. I'm a communications professional, and I think I want to start with a disclaimer that all the views, the comments, the questions, they're my own, and they don't represent those of my employer. But with that out the way, I think let's get on with the business of today. So today we'll be connecting the dots between global power and the daily realities of Africans and global South citizens. And many people hear G20 and think it's something that's far removed, something that happens in other parts of the world and behind closed doors, which some of that may be true. But this year, the G20 is much, much closer to home, taking place in all sorts of parts of the country. And though it is still behind closed doors, I think that in truth what happens in those rooms touches on everything, our wallets, our economies, and even how resilient our media can be. So for the next few minutes, myself and our panelists will unpack what the G20 actually is and how it affects the global South, and particularly Africa, and why the media's role in global governance has never been more critical. So I'll pose a few guiding questions, and then we'll open the floor to you for your questions. So can we begin with introductions? I ask each of you to introduce yourselves?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is DIRCO. I'm from Mistra, Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections. So it's a think tank based in Woodmead, Johannesburg. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gisao Bakanin Simupipi. I'm a researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, which is a foreign policy think tank, and co-convener of this year's T20, which is a formal engagement group of the G20, along with my colleague.
Thank you. Ashraf Patel, Institute for Global Dialogue, focusing on digital society. Also with my colleagues, we're part of what is called T20, which stands for Think 20, which kind of engages the different G20 processes. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. So once again, many people hear G20 but don't understand what it does or why it matters. Could you start by breaking down in plain terms what the G20 is and how its decisions impact the daily lives of people in the Global South and the African continent specifically. I'd like each of you to...
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Many of you would have seen when you go to government building, you see like banners, big banners outside the buildings written G20. So it's a lot of fanfare throughout the county about G20. And a lot of people I've realized they really don't care much or don't know much about what really G20 is. But it's really a global economic forum for sorting out some of the global issues that affect, economic issues that affect the global economy. I think perhaps maybe to really, we have to start where exactly did this thing start. It started in 1999 after the Asian financial crisis. So when the global leaders, these are the group of 7 countries, they realized that the global economic responses that they could mount was not sufficient, and therefore they organized several other countries, 19 of them, which were, I think, accountable for about 85% of GDP, 75% of global trade, almost 2/3 of the world population. They stood together. This was an informal forum at the start of finance ministers and board and governors of central banks, where they discuss, they try to coordinate responses to this Asian financial crisis. But when the 2008 financial crisis hit, they realized that it could no longer be an informal structure anymore. So they needed to elevate it to some kind of a global summit where the head of states will come in, of those 20 countries will come in and then discuss or coordinate responses to the global financial crisis. Mainly they were focusing on macroeconomic stability, financial stability, global financial architecture, how organizations such as World Bank and IMF are supposed to respond to this global crisis. And of course, with time, as time moves on, after the 2000 financial crisis, they also realized that they needed to expand the mandate a little bit. So the focus shifted a lot more to things related to climate finance, energy security, employment, sustainable development. So it became this global forum where global leaders come together to engage and coordinate interventions that are needed to deal with some of the pressing global economic and social as well as environmental issues. And that's what we really have today as the G20. So it's obviously rotating throughout the various members. Currently sitting in South Africa, coming back from India and Brazil. So it is South Africa's leg currently, where obviously South Africa has also put numerous issues that I'm sure we'll discuss on the table that are going to be discussed during the upcoming Leaders Summit in December.
Thank you. I think for the most part, you've given quite a comprehensive overview. So as to add the rotating presidency aspect, the value in that is the presidency who chairs the G20 at a particular year in time has the opportunity to really set an agenda and essentially direct what the conversation is about by G20 members. And so I think part of the reason why the African continent and South Africans felt a bit far removed from the G20 before this year was because South Africa was not setting the agenda, But another part of that I think is important on the agenda setting is that really countries are able to reflect priorities, policy priorities that are both local and in South Africa's context, regional as well. So for instance, the issue of debt sustainability, seems like a far removed issue, but it's really something that is relevant to the community in South Africa because it affects, government expenditure and things like that. So I think for now, that's what I'll add. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks,
Nancy. Thanks, colleagues. I think the G20 cliche has been in media for the past year. And to build on colleagues, it's important to note that the G20 is not a kind of formal organization. It's a forum, and unlike the United Nations, none of its outcomes has any standing in international relations or international law. So that is the first step. So it's mainly a kind of agenda setting forum, and in its formation, its core objective was to save the world from the financial crisis. So its first set of meetings early on, as colleagues mentioned, was mainly meetings of central banks and treasury ministries. But over the years, it has mushroomed. So some of the IR scholars are debating whether the G20 is kind of scope creeping into the UN functions, and that's a valid argument. If you look at the last few years, every theme from climate change to gender to labor law, etc., are included in the agenda. You have the UN that has all these entities, whether it's the ILO or UNESCO or the COP30 processes. So therein is a robust debate on a kind of elite agenda setting and kind of encroaching into the work of the UN. And that is where the contestation is, because the majority of the Global South nations are actually excluded from the G20. And that brings in bigger questions on democracy, on whether it is actually democratic or elitist. And I think this discourse is not coming through in the media. You know, you refer to the G20 as if it's a normal institution that citizens have a stake, but citizens have very little stake in the G20 and its agenda setting. So that's a bit of the more critical view, but I think it's an important one.
Okay, so thank you all for that breakdown and for letting us know that the G20 is not actually a formal structure and that it just sets the agenda. So then that leads us to the next question, which is that the G20 often positions itself as a global corporation, but does it adequately represent the realities of the Global South? And is the Global South still sitting at a table that's built by others for their own interests? Who wants to go first?
No problem. Thank you very much for that question. I think I'll address that question on this note. Two concepts of input legitimacy and output legitimacy, right? So input legitimacy in a process refers to the democratic process of the United Nations, for instance, where all the 193 member states are represented at the table and are able to weigh in on issues, which then sort of fosters the political will or momentum or whatever outcome comes out of that process, right? The G20, as my colleague has rightly pointed out, is representative of a few countries who are considered, systemically important within the global economic and financial architecture. So my argument is, to some point, and then output legitimacy on the other hand refers to the process where though there may not be that input representation, some of the outputs or outcomes can still address some issues that are relevant to those who are not at the table. So I would argue that the G20, yes, does not have input legitimacy, but to some extent, and on some issues, has been a key actor in producing outcomes that are legitimate on issues of financial sector stability, like my colleague had mentioned. The Financial Stability Board is a key sort of outcome of the G20, which is currently the watchdog of financial sector issues on the global stage. However, on the other side, as you rightly point out, there's also this mismatch between global north, global south within the table. And within that, I also argue that there is two dimensions to it. Firstly, yes, the table might have been set by the global north, but I do believe that it is an important forum that unlike some of the other forums like the G7, for instance, is actually bringing divergent views onto the table. So we see, for instance, with the last 3 presidencies of the developing world, being Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, really pushing an agenda that is development orientated, you know? And when we speak about consensus, it's a different issue. But I would argue that there is an element of representation, but there is still room for reform in how the G20 sort of frames itself in terms of how it represents matters of the global south. And I would argue that the South African presidency is actually a model for how that could be done in its way, in its engagement with the AU during its presidency, for instance, by ensuring that it has consultations, not just with the AU in terms of its permanent membership at the G20, but in a way that reflects regional perspectives. So when countries who are at the table are able to rope in their regions, rope in those issues, it creates that output legitimacy. But you know, we can't ignore the elephant in the room around representation. And yeah, I think that's...
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would frame the question a bit differently. So I would say whether the Global South have actually taken advantage of the G20 itself, given the fact that we are on the 3rd cycle of this Global South presidency, from Brazil to India, now to South Africa. So when you look at Brazil, I mean, when you look at what Brazil actually put at the center stage of the agenda at the time, I think they agreed on a global alliance for poverty reduction, aligning to the NDP, I mean the SDG goals, which was seen as a leap from what the G20 declarations used to focus on. And we've also, I mean, the G20 leaders, to my surprise, they also agreed to the taxing of the super rich, which is something that is not unheard of in those sectors because they are overrepresented by, you know, these developed countries which are anti-taxation. So they do not necessarily put inequality issues on the center stage. But with the Brazil presidency, they will manage to agree on whether they proceeded to go and the different countries proceeded to go and introduce legislations that tax the super rich is another thing. But at least the issue was put on the table. And then India itself, I think one of the unique situation about India was the 100% consensus that they're able to achieve through all of the declarations that they put on the table, mainly, I think, putting what you call digital public infrastructure at the center stage as an instrument for development, for example. So I think to a certain extent, these two countries have put issues that are really, they've taken advantage of the priorities that really speak to the global south. Whether whether we go on and proceed to implement those declarations or put resources into those declarations is another thing. Where I think the G20 would say, and it's a continuous struggle, it's really related to the issue around debt when it relates to public debt, when it relates to those highly indebted countries in Africa. We know that they agreed to a common framework which sought to relieve some of these highly indebted countries over the years. But what has happened over time, I think there's only been 3 countries, Ghana, and I don't know, a few other countries that were able to resolve their debt through that common framework. And the issue now currently is that this ongoing public debt of African countries is increasing, and obviously that is taking away the resources, it's taking away resources that should be used for education, healthcare. And the question is, what do you then do to relieve? And currently with these geopolitical tensions between South Africa, the US and China, it's becoming increasingly, it looks like it's going to be increasingly difficult to agree on this debt relief mechanism for the EU, even despite the fact that South Africa has put that debt restructuring back on the agenda. So we'll see what is going to happen, but at least for South Africa itself, it has also managed to put some of the issues that will speak to the global south, energy security and infrastructure, as I said, global debt restructuring, and also climate change finance. Climate change finance is also a tricky one because post the 2020 COP 21, there was an agreement among some of the G20 developed countries to provide financing to the tune of about $100 billion a year per annum over the period. That has not been achieved, and the question is, why are these commitments? Why do these G20 constantly come up with these commitments that the countries do not adhere to? So, which coming back to your question is that we may be able to put these issues that speak to the global south on the agenda, but the problem is with the implementation and the execution of those declarations that then kind of almost put us on the back foot. Thanks.
Thanks. So just to build on, I mean, I generally agree with the colleagues, noting that you have both the G7 core of the North and the BRICS. All are members, the BRICS core, members of the G20. So there is a lot of contestation, and it is susceptible to these geopolitics. Therefore, any outcomes will always be diluted. And last year, under President Lula of Brazil, you had one of the strongest G20 statements on major issues of the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, be it in poverty, inequality, as well as the wealth tax. Unfortunately, the South African presidency came in at a time that converged with the Trump administration coming into power, and that kind of nationalism from the US has now kind of constrained the policy space. So a lot of the outcomes is very, very diluted. So even within the core function of the G20, which is financial architecture and reform, you look at the tax on the ultra-rich, that is now diluted. The Cost of Capital Commission, we started the year, South Africa saying we are going to push for this Cost of Capital Commission because Africa pays the highest cost for capital and interest. That is diluted. The Trump administration is only interested in one or two agenda items, and ironically, they're only interested in the finance track. And why do you think so? Is it because they're interested in finance for the global south? No. The US is facing a government shutdown. They have no money. They're $38 trillion in debt, and they need capital inflows from the global south to help save their economy. So they're going to run with their agenda. They're in it for the G20, but they only want to have the treasury ministries and the central banks, and that's all, because they need the capital inflow from the south back to the US. So everything's kind of vested interest in the G20. There is no charity. You look at the UN Finance for Development Summit, the Seville Summit, the commitments from COP, none of that has come through from the North. And the lost and damaged funds that were promised 3 years ago, very little has been distributed to the G20. So what's happening now is they're coming through as recycled development capital. Good example, President Ramaphosa signed the deal with the EU last week on $12.9 billion in green energy. That money was meant for the global south, for loss and damage funds. It's now been recycled to South Africa as kind of hybrid finance. So those loans are payable. So the big irony is if we go headlong with these kind of deals, South Africa is going to plunge into a new round of debt. So the irony being we'll be a host country of a G20 and we're taking new loans, green loans, and that's going to plunge us further into debt. So the question is whether the G20 is a development platform or a northern-centric platform to extract resources from the south. I think it's the latter. So I always give very sobering assessments. So that's the role of us as researchers. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for all of that breakdown. And I think this is a good transition because when South Africa then took over the G20 presidency last December, they announced that solidarity, equality, sustainability, that was their main theme, and as a response to the current global uncertainties. And overall, as you've pointed out, South Africa focuses on like the resilience, the fairness, the inclusivity, and sustainability, etc. And also, like most of the ministers have said, like Ubuntu as a guiding principle for all of those priorities. And I guess that also does mean making sure that global recovery and green growth works for everyone and not just a few. So, in contrast then, the United States, as you've said, announced that when it takes over the presidency, they're returning economies back to their financial roots. So the question is, how will this impact the longevity of South Africa's current priorities when the US takes over in December?
Oh, okay, I can go. So I think part of, the first part is, this is where the structure kind of benefits South Africa a bit, right?
Okay.
Because of the cherry picking ability of countries in terms of the agendas that they set. But also, once the country sets a particular agenda or sets up a particular platform, that becomes sort of embedded in the G20 sort of accountability framework and sort of, it doesn't get erased, if that makes sense. So the question is for South Africa in terms of how it engages with other G20 partners who align with those priorities, who will then be able to move the needle on some of those priorities. For instance, it's been highlighted that the United Kingdom might take over after the US presidency. So South Africa must already start having those engagements with the United Kingdom around carrying over some of those priorities where there is alignment, because unfortunately, that's just how it works. And I think for me, that would be the best course of action in sustaining the agenda items. Number two is also referring to the point that my colleague made about the G20 and what it is. It is an informal forum after all. So it means that it's not the end-all, be-all in terms of agendas and the priorities that you advance. South Africa should be able to carry on or sustain the momentum of its priorities in other global processes. Whatever it has advanced, for instance, on climate finance, should still be advanced at COP this year, next year, in other UN processes. You know, the issue around taxation, for instance. There's a whole UN tax negotiation process that's currently underway, where South Africa can continue the momentum in the conversation around those priorities. So for me, the G20 is not the end of it. Certainly the US presidency is not the end of South Africa's agenda if it's able to push across other forums. Thank you.
Well, I mean, fortunately, the G20 framework works on a three-year cycles. I forgot the terminology for it. So,
Troika,
yes. So, as you say, I mean, the issue is just to wait it out for the US president to pass through and then find the G20 members who align with your interests. Fortunately, you've got a BRICS bloc in there. You've got the EU bloc that is sympathetic to some of the socio-economic issues which are being raised by the Global South. So, hopefully, if whatever the agenda that is set by the US after the UK takeover, we may likely, after the UK takeover, we may likely to see those issues being re-emerging. And actually, they might align with the UK's current economic realities, because the UK economy is really going through a lot of issues, almost similar to South Africa. So you're more likely to see the UK government almost taking adopting some of the agendas which have been adopted by the global South. So I think we're still in a good hands. The only catch for me here is that there's a declining global finance for some of these socio-economic priorities. And with China receding its financing, it's pulling back some of the funding that it used to provide to some of the African countries and maybe Caribbean countries, we might likely to find the shortage or the lack of funding for some of those priorities, which begs then the question, where is the funding going to come from to deal with some of these priorities which have been identified at this level? And obviously this then comes back to domestic prioritization at country level, so that whatever global social, whatever priorities which have been identified at these global forums are dealt with through domestic resources. So this is where domestic resource mobilization becomes extremely important, so that we don't only rely on international finances, but countries need to find better ways of raising finance. And fortunately, this is one of the issues that the cost of capital commission is putting on the table, not just to make sure that we don't, Africa and other developing countries borrow at a lesser interest, but they also ensure or strengthen their domestic resource mobilization to finance some of the priorities identified at G20. Thank you.
Thanks, colleague. So basically, I do agree that the other forums, the UN, offers the institutional architecture for all these themes, both from the G20 and the G77. The big issues, of course, are global institutions are rupturing. And with the World Trade Organization now in the headwinds of the Trump administration, that poses several challenges for Africa and the poorer G77 nations. Remember that one of the successes of globalization has been the WTO for the last 30 years. But in its wake, there's been a widespread critique from both the kind of progressive left as well as the right. So the Trump kind of nationalist view these institutions, they call them globalists, and they're very much opposed to kind of the globalist G20 agenda. They perceive it as taking policy making from the national to the global. So they oppose it from a different perspective. Whereas like the left, the trade unions, the civil societies, the debt groups, the labor, they're also critical of the G20, but for different reasons. And I think that's the nuance that I don't see being reported in the media. And there's this massive push from both sides, the Trumpist, nationalist, and the kind of anti-globalist, internationalist. And that's because this kind of democratic globalization dividend of the last 30 years embodied in the G20 has kind of failed. And therefore you're getting this Gen Z protests mushrooming, mainly because the social compact is not delivering. And you see it in from Madagascar to Morocco to Kenya. Kenya especially is an interesting case. Kenya has always been regarded as a case study for a kind of liberalized World Bank poster child for Africa. It's always been a superstar. And it's literally gone to ground zero in the last 2 years. And incidentally, it was kind of marketed as the Silicon Valley tech-driven utopia. You had all the big tech getting kind of supporting the whole ecosystem there. But the problem is, the more they negotiated with the Kenyan government, through G20 frameworks, through these kind of bilateral investment treaties, and when African nations are at its weakest when it negotiates individually as nation states with large economies. So they get into what is called bilateral investment treaties. And that's where they lose out on policy sovereignty. The G20 doesn't help you, neither does the AU. So a bigger question is the AU really relevant? Is it just an amalgamation of associations of countries? Do they really have an agenda that is there to protect the policy sovereignty of African countries? And I think generally not. So the big question we need to ourselves, is this really an African G20, or is it merely a G20 taking place on African soil? I think that's where the media narrative is missing the story. So the real story is in these kind of nuances And I think that's where the media could kind of do more of the critical reporting on the G20.
Well, that's the next question then. What can civil society, the media, and policy makers do to keep these priorities alive of the G20 presidency, even though South Africa hands over to the US shortly? What can we do as the media, as civil society? What is your advice?
Okay, I'll conclude.
Yeah.
So essentially, yes, we have a robust civil society in South Africa, fortunately. I think many nation states in our own neighborhood don't have that. So the first thing is always been civil society, NGOs. The solidarity side, solidarity is a key theme of the G20. I would say your first step is solidarity with civil society in Africa and the Global South, especially these days, I think Mozambique, Eswatini, Zimbabwe, Congo, even countries like Kenya, Nigeria. There's a lot of crackdown on media. And that is because the kind of political elites have come to the realization that the current pathways are not delivering the services or the goods to their people. And therefore, there is much more kind of, the word one of the scholars used the other day was authoritarian neoliberalism. Now, this is the kind of model we're seeing in Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, maybe even in South Africa. So you need to push these neoliberal reforms, but you know it's going to be unpopular, but you then need a very strong authoritarian. So that's where repression comes in. And I think that is the story that's going to be quite a real, the new normal. You're seeing it in Morocco, Madagascar, how are states coping. And sometimes, yes, there are repressive states, but it's not actually the fault of only the political elites in Africa and the Global South. It's because the global system has kind of given them only one way. You know, the famous saying of Thatcher, there is no alternative. And that is what is being thrust upon a lot of the poorest states in the Global South. They have no alternative. There's no convening power. They're not part of large blocs like BRICS. A lot of them are sitting in the G77, which is not as strong as the G20. And so there's an absolute hierarchy. South Africa is just fortunate, I don't know, geographic-wise, but I don't even think the reason why we're in the G20, I mean, on what basis were we selected? You know, is it because of, let's say, Mandela, or on what basis? I mean, economically, there's other countries on the continent that actually can fulfill that role. So we do punch above our weight as South Africans on the global stage, but with that comes a massive responsibility. And I think civil society and media in particular needs to amplify that, the solidarity component, instead of the co-option. There's a lot of co-option to kind of write narratives that suit the mainstream. And you know, you open any mainstream paper, absolutely you'll think that they are actually PR kind of consultants for the G20. We need much more critical reporting on the G20. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, anybody else?
I'll just add on the narratives part. I think narratives matter a lot, especially in this age of misinformation and disinformation. Actually, I was reading a World Economic Forum report the other day which ranked misinformation and disinformation as the highest global risk in the short term, so between now and 2027, which shows that there's a fundamental issue around trust within the global system, number one. And part of the reason why I say narratives matter, particularly in the African context, is that especially when you connect it to the agenda issues that are within the G20, a lot of those issues are often externally defined. You look at the issue of debt sustainability, for instance, the credit perceptions of African countries are informed by sort of the narratives that have been shaped out there and then deflected onto the continent. So I think the media plays a critical role in painting the African picture, number one. And number two, I think also on the aspect around the relevance of the African Union, because to be fair, the G20, in as much as we can question its legitimacy, unfortunately, it's where the global powers meet and discuss, you know? So the question becomes, how do civil society and media kind of push our national governments at local level to engage with the AU, to equip the AU with the mandate to effectively advocate for African issues that and reflect a local context on those issues as well. So I think civil society has a critical role in engaging their policymakers in that regard as well. And I think I'll end it there for now.
Okay, I want to pick up from that. Oh, you still want to say something, Mistra? Yeah. Please continue.
Just a quick one. I think the issue of reporting accurately and critically is very important. I mean, when I was reading the preface to this current session, I mean, I thought I'm going to take a jibe at the media because I saw something that said, with the Trump administration not likely to attend, is it time to reflect on what? And I thought if there was any reason for us to reflect, it should not be because the Trump administration is not attending the G20 South African presidency or summit. It should be other things. So it should be connecting the G20 with the real life issues that people experience on a daily basis. For instance, if you go to Ghana, for instance, recently, they were about to they were failing to repay some of their debt. And should they have failed, it was going to be a disaster for that economy. And through the intervention of the common framework, that economy was saved. So it's these stories that connect people to real life stories about what interventions agreed at this level does to climate change, for instance. So it's really about access to water. If there's no climate finance, if this commitment about climate finance are not met, it means that a number of people are going to have trouble having access to water, air quality issues. So those are the real life issues that I think maybe the media can help us can help us to amplifying the importance of G20 to the global south. Thanks.
Thank you. I would say that the media is willing to actually help with those issues, but media issues are still missing from the formal G20 agenda. So the recent Joburg Declaration, they called for a stronger recognition of information integrity and digital rights as the pillars of democracy and inclusive development, which is fair. So why do you think that these issues are still not finding their way into the formal agenda? And what is the risk of leaving media and digital rights out of global governance conversations? Yes, please go.
Okay, I think the seeds are there, particularly within the Digital Economy Working Group, and I would attribute that largely to the Brazilian presidency last year, who put information integrity as a thematic issue within the Digital Economy Working Group, which South Africa has then sort of picked up into this AI governance conversation, which was had both within the working group as well as within the AI task force that South Africa set up. So I think there's already sort of a foundation to build on in terms of integrating the voice of media onto the G20 agenda. I do think there was a bit of a missed opportunity to go even further on some of those issues. And the risk is simply, the reality is that information integrity is at the center of global power structures, you know. So we are currently in a global context where there's increased polarization, shifting narratives, the militarization of information. So those are issues that the G20 cannot ignore because they strike at the heart of global economic governance. So I think there is certainly a need for a broader, maybe, engagement on that as well. Another part of that argument, and maybe it might be a bit of a, other side of the coin, that I would like to challenge is to ask ourselves whether the G20 is the relevant platform to take up that issue in the first place, Because part of the reason why the G20 is increasingly sort of roped into these geopolitical tensions is because of its expanding agenda. Yeah. Historically, I think the G20 has proven itself in terms of being a crisis management tool for financial sector issues. But I think if, for instance, COVID is anything to demonstrate, and some of the frameworks like the G20 Common Framework that were mentioned, is that when it comes to societal and developmental issues, it's not the best forum for advancing some of those issues. So I think there's a need for a sort of like a double-sided way of approaching these issues within the G20 context as well. And also to add to that, the more we expand the agenda, the more there's opportunity for divergences. So we see, for instance, this year with the Digital Economy Working Group, a very good outcome document not being able to come out as a communique on the basis of, geopolitics at play from the US and things like that. So then one would ask themselves, to what extent are countries actually going to implement that, and things like that. So there's a lot of considerations around, for me, whether the G20 would be the best platform to serve that issue. But yeah.
So thanks. I generally agree. I think absolutely the G20 Digital Economy Working Group, there was a massive contestation on the outcome. And again, it's South Africa trying to tread very lightly, walking on eggshells. Because if you're coming with a communique that's going to be handed over to the US presidency and they don't like it, they're going to literally just dismiss it out of hand. So I think it was a tactic to say, let us have a more watered down approach. At least a few sentences of the themes of the M20 and G20 can get into the communique, because I can tell you right now, under the Trump administration, both Trump and J.D. Vance are on an absolute attack on all regulations regarding whether it's AI, media, or tech. And it's very ideological. In fact, they're going for the EU. Every EU regulation that kind of puts some guardrails on information integrity, on freedom of anything. They actually don't want to even hear that. And in fact, what they're doing is, if you include those things of regulation, free speech, and all of that, is they link that to trade deals. So for the very first time, they're weaponizing this whole media, free speech ecosystem that we take as first generation rights. They're taking that and they're weaponizing it in trade deals. So South Africa is caught right in the middle of that. You actually putting this regulation of AI, we're going to nail you in the next trade talks or tariff talks. They're doing it now with Europe, India, you name it, Canada, Australia. So they're very emotional about this because there's a lot of ideological, in my understanding, what the IR scholars in the US are saying, is this kind of culture wars in the US. And they're actually worlds apart. So there's actually two United States. There's the nationalist, make America great side, and there's the rest, which is kind of more about diversity, embracing the global culture. And in the middle, there's no gulf. There's kind of, it's a very polarized, and that is coming through in the current Trump and J.D. Vance approach to information integrity. And I think that the strategy would be just to go back to the UN. UNESCO has got all of that, information integrity guidelines, the UNESCO platform guidelines, the ITU has got the guidelines, and even the UN Sustainable Development Goals if you just go back to that, there's a strong role for media and information in development. So you got to continue with the campaigns. Rights-based approach to development is only one side. But, the other thing is, don't neglect the development divide or the digital divide. So I see too much, yes, there has to be information integrity, but what about connectivity and affordability? So if you want a more relevant slogan for society, say information integrity with connectivity and affordability, then you're including most of the kind of population. So currently to sell something like info integrity to an ordinary South African, he or she is grappling with data costs or connectivity. It's going to be a lower level of priority. And so you need to be more creative with your campaigns. Link information integrity with affordability of data. And we still have a very high data kind of cost structure in South Africa. So these are kind of advices, just coming from a research perspective.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, without necessarily responding to the question directly, I think there's also a need to just on the side of caution here, not to contribute to priority overload for the G20. Because what tends to happen is that then there's a priority drift. So all the priorities erode, new priorities erode the older ones. So we already have quite a number of initiatives within the G20. We've got the U20, Y20, Women 20, M20, all of this. All of them demand the attention of these global leaders. And I just don't think it is the right, it's got the right capability and capacity to handle that much of priority. So just as much as we really need to see the media priorities reflected in we also need to err in the sort of caution so that we address these issues in the relevant forums that my colleagues have spoken to. Thanks.
Thanks so much. So I want to ask just the very last question before we open it up to the audience. So if we walk away today and we still don't engage with what's happening in the G20, what is at stake for us as Africans, as media and civil society practitioners, and as the Global South? So just in closing.
Okay, what is at stake for us is that, firstly, we're going to spend 1 billion rand on that thing. So it's a big issue. We've got commissions currently running about money being spent. But I think really the issue, what is really at stake is really about how these decisions that are taken at that level affect an ordinary person on the street, and making sure that an ordinary person gets to understand how these decisions affect them. So the fact that the G20 is able to take decisions about global financial stability, how does it affect me as an individual? It affects me because there's lower inflation, I'm able to afford food. So those are the realities we need to reflect as we depart from here, and how do we then take the message out to ordinary citizens. It's really about how do we then make sure that we've got access to information that is being shared at these numerous tracks, and the Shepherd tracks and the finance tracks and all those working groups, that an ordinary person has got access to has access to information and outcomes of those meetings. Currently, it's only few people who have got access to those. We don't necessarily know what is going to happen. And most likelihood is that we only get to know about some of those outcomes during the Leaders Summit or the so-called social summit that is going to be taking place not so very long. So I think it's just to making sure that, and again, the media just making sure that on a timely basis, we get to hear more about some of the previous commitments which the G20 has taken, so that we don't lose track of those. And when we meet with these G20 leaders, we actually take them to account about the commitments they've made and why they have not been adhering to those commitments. So that I think that's for me the takeaway from here. Thanks.
Thank you. Just to build off of the accountability aspect, especially the question that was posed earlier around the last 4 presidencies in the developing world, looking into those priorities and really seeing that our governments are held accountable for actually following through on those commitments on the issues where they were able to achieve consensus. For instance, I would really like to see a bit more engagement on the South African side around the issue of international taxation, especially considering what Brazil did last year. I really think I agree with my colleague that issue has been lost in the conversation a bit. Another aspect that I would like to also emphasize is that we need to sort of reflect on the relevancy of the G20, its structure as well, and maybe that's a research question, showing my researcher background there. So part of South Africa's commitments this year, given that it's the last presidency in the first rotation of presidencies, is to produce a report on the G20 as a structure. So it's sort of a review of the Sherpa and finance tracks and how they've been able to, how effective they've been essentially. And I think that will be an important report for us to sort of interact with in terms of charting forward and also engaging with governments on how we'd like to see them put or engage on the G20 scale moving forward, and whatever reforms might be suggested out of that report might also inform that engagement. So I think yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, generally agrees. I agree with the fellow colleagues. I think as civil society, you can participate. There is the Social 20, which supposedly is going to be the event for society, civil society. Apparently, there's also another C20 called Civil 20. I'm not sure how they interact and what they do, what's the overlap. Whether they are kind of taking the more civil has showed us the way. They were very vibrant. The Social 20 in Brazil was set a progressive agenda that allowed the Brazilian presidency and the president to. Do we have that in South Africa? Are we a socially cohesive society to achieve that? I'm not sure, but I think it's worth an input. And legacy, I mean, R1 billion spent on G20, what are the outcomes? And, is it just talk shops? Some of the critical public policy scholars are saying, crop of every ministry, they involved in every G20 in Durban, are they fulfilling their democratic mandate? They're implementing policy that the electorate voted them for. And this is a critique of the G20 with a kind of society. So that's a critical view of the G20. That, is it bringing new kinds of policies through the back door? Policy sovereignty. So these are questions journalists must ask, critical questions. And maybe one way I would suggest is for the media to say, let us have a G20 scorecard going forward. So this money that we invested is not lost. So as the media, you create a scorecard for each department. The working group communiques, which is very detailed, follow that, track that, and say, Ministry of Trade and Industry or Communications or Social Development or Youth and Movement, what have you achieved? We've spent so much money as South Africa's taxpayers on the G20, so make them accountable maybe through a mechanism like a scorecard and keep them accountable, because it's a huge investment. And then maybe if we don't achieve it, then next year you will get a VAT increase because a lot of money has gone into this, and then the consumers are going to pay if developmental dividend. So the big question everyone is asking, why is there an attack on global, both the left and the right globally are the news, the conflicts against the global institutions. So very big questions, but media has to dissect it. Of the suggestion I would make.
Yes.
Yeah, just the last quick one. I think we can all be, because what you observe is that a lot of organizations are co-opted into these initiatives, and as soon as they become about the G20 itself, they then become a kind of a mouthpiece for the use really the outcomes that comes out of some of these work groups.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'd now like to open up questions and your reflections. Thank you. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Amir. I am from Oxfam, South Africa. I am the campaigning and media lead on it. I have two questions, and it's open to all three of you, and perhaps I should have brought it up in the last panel where we had more media people present. But thank you so much for the great panel, firstly. I have two questions. I want to speak about the role of media in G20, and my comments are not necessarily coming from a place away from the actual Leaders Summit. So, you know, as Oxfam Africa, we've been involved with G20 and every single official engagement group at every level, you know, contributing to policy, to hosting side events, and despite all of this, we have kept media in the loop throughout this process and have provided them with support, whether it is in terms of content or financial support if needs be, because we know media landscape in South Africa is relatively, you know, under pressure. But despite all of that, there's been zero media interest. There's been literally zero media interest in terms of covering or even engaging with what has been going on with the G20 process. And as much as, you know, we talk about these issues and whether this is the right platform or not, it's been relatively disappointing, for lack of a better word, to just see that lack of engagement. So the question is, how do we include media better? How do we make sure that this bridge can be stronger than what it is? That's the first question. And the second question is around government. Same with the G20 process. We've been supporting government, you know, around what has been happening around, you know, inequality, particularly under the G20. And I'm not sure if people in media know, but there was a media accreditation process for the media center that's going to be at the Leaders Summit. Colleagues both locally and internationally in civil society and media, they've had their media accreditation denied, meaning that the government is kind of using gatekeeping as a tool to maybe shape the narrative of what is happening at the Leaders Summit. So what do we do in that case? How do we kind of pressure government to open up a little more to make sure that there's fair representation, first and foremost, and that there's a democratized narrative building around what has been happening in South Africa? And lastly, well, two points. If you're in media, come speak to me. If you're in G20 process. And secondly, we are developing a scorecard around, you know, the G20 investment in South Africa. Thank you.
Was there anyone else with a question?
Hi, can I please sit down? I'm a bit nervous. My name is Abba. I'm a student journalist here at Wits University. And I was just wondering, because you mentioned media not being active in these G20 initiatives. Sorry, I'm so nervous. So my question is, I'm going to particularly speak for the youth, right? Is media really not doing enough in terms of telling these stories? Or is it that us as the youth, we're just negligent, right? And we do not engage?
Thank you. Thanks for your question. Anyone else? Okay, can I ask the panelists to then respond? You.
Okay, let me, you know, try and work with the associations to assist you. There should be no reason for rejecting coverage. But started the Social 20, you know, that is where the social sector will gather and discuss critically the big issues and then get the media. I mean, hopefully the media will report on the Social 20. I doubt it will be as dynamic as the Brazilian or Indian presidencies, which really incorporated civil society. But maybe the media should ask more critical questions. Why? Why is, despite the poverty levels, inequality levels, why is there so much curation around G20 activities? And it's the role of the media to begin to do report, connect to local stories if there is lack of service delivery in Joburg or anywhere in the if there is climate crises, how do you connect that to the lack of funding in climate finance from the north based on their lost and damaged funds commitment? And once you connect the stories to the global institutions, it would make more sense. The youth in India and Brazil were much more proactive. We're not sure, in South Africa where that is and the reasons thereof. But issues of student debt is another. G20 is about debt. Its number one kind of thing is financial reform and how do you address national debt. And I think in South Africa there is that thing where the student debt is now completely unsustainable. That's a big story. And you're beginning to see that emerge at different universities. Now, how is that linked to the G20? What is going to be the final communiques from the finance ministers' meetings? Because, that is the real one. The finance minister and communique is quite core to the G20. That literally goes to the leadership summit. But also the other working groups, as my colleague said, digital economy, trade, social, climate change, critical minerals, and just energy transition. These apparently are the big themes. And in each one of them, there seems to be massive impacts in different constituencies. Labor is one, environment is another. So those would be the kind of segues into getting the local story into the media. But participate. Social 20 is happening, civil 20 is happening. They're all on social media, and it's for the progressives to kind of put their voices into those platforms.
I'll just add to the youth aspect. I do think there is an argument to be made around being a bit more proactive, but with reference to, for instance, the Y20 engagement group, this year specifically, there were some coordination challenges at the beginning of the year that I think made even youth that were interested in participating and, being involved in the process a little bit harder to also get up to speed and catch that momentum. We were doing a series of G20 roadshows in some of the universities around the country. And while, for instance, youth may be willing to participate in these spaces, they're always looking for a value add, and I think that's where the narrative also comes in. How is this relevant to us? How is this process going to benefit us? So I think it's also making the argument for youth to participate and highlighting why the G20 as a process and also the Y20 as an engagement group is something that is important for youth to engage in. But I also do think that, definitely, I think when you seek out these opportunities, you will find them. But I think that's it.
Yeah, speaking, I'm from outside the media, so I'm looking within. So I think we probably need post-breaking news narratives so that when there's a media conference on the G20, it does not degenerate into why the US is not attending the G20. Because then I'm not sure how much of, to put it in a better way, how much of a training or how much are the reporters engaged with the previous G20s, so that they keep track of the issues which have been raised before, so that when there is a media conference about the South African G20, there's a follow-through about some of these issues which have been raised before. It does not necessarily degenerate into the current breaking news about people not, some people not attending and not attending. And maybe even to a certain extent, I mean, as a researcher, you actually find that there's a lot of coverage on the G20 by international media than there is about local media. And really, it's really concerning that we have this opportunity ourselves to be covering, news. And I suspect there's because of the over-politicization of our news headline, that we tend to focus on these political issues and then ignore some of and increasingly you don't necessarily find media houses that focuses on, strictly economic and business news where they really tackle substantive issues within, rather than the big headline. So I think maybe to a certain extent, it also needs some reflection from the media itself about what type of how much do reporters engage with the reports from the G20? Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, William, we'll go with you. But quickly, because we're just running over, I think.
Okay. I mean, thank you. It's been fascinating hearing this, and you don't get this in our media. And against that, of course, our media are going to say, well, we've only got so many journalists. Have you seen what's happening at the Madlanga Commission? Like, this sort of nonsense. And then, of course, they're going to pick on the big thing, which is America hampering and undermining and derailing every single thing, right? So the Digital Economy Working Group, they couldn't issue a declaration because the states and their allies said, no, this can only be a statement, a chairperson statement. They did that for the AI task force as well. So if you're then saying to media, well, we want you to dedicate a lot of time and energy to focusing on this and the issues, when they know almost ahead of time that it's going to just be derailed by the states, then you say to them, well, of course they're going to not then report on that, because they're going to say, well, what's the consequence for us other than it being a big fat waste of money or leveling some of those legitimate critiques? And so I guess, we need to understand that, and the fact that when media go and speak to them, as we did as M20, again and again and again and again and again and again and again, more often than Donald Trump lies, right, which is pretty extraordinary, and yet still those sentences and those issues don't get put on the agenda. And then they want to say to the media, well, why aren't you reporting on all of these things, because they're really big and important, and we expect you to read a 35-page document, when media are like, have you seen the Madlanga Commission? Like, wake up, right? Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Sometimes we have to be honest about understanding the challenges in the media. And also, conversely speaking, look at ourselves. What does your strategy say? You are looking for media coverage, but does it talk to your strategy? Have you engaged the media? So sometimes we throw stones at the media, they didn't do this, but we don't go and look back at whether our strategy, whether it's there, whether it's working, it's implementable, whether you can monitor and evaluate it. So that would be my advice. Look at the strategy, engage the media, and then monitor it, in terms of coverage, because you expect coverage just because it's G20. Coverage, you should earn it. You're not going to get it. My second point, my young girl, you did very well. Have the courage to speak. Don't panic. Everyone panics, even the best of the best. Those who know, they get some. You deserve an applause for standing as a young student speaking up. An applause.
All right, do you want to respond just quickly? Oh, there's another question. Okay, sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Mabatu Makotanyane, and I'm a freelance journalist. So just to answer to that, in the media we have this famous saying that says, where it bleeds, it leads. So now when news break, this is what us as journalists go after, right? So now when we have tea or soft news, we don't really go after that, right? The other panelist earlier said that it is difficult to also interview the president. So now as the journalists, we want news from the president. But if there's limitations, Why must we be told where to go and where not to go when the president himself, who has to account, does not want to talk to the media? That's why, as the media, we have specialized beats where we know this is where we go and this is where we do not go.
Okay, so I think we'll close it off there with the questions. Any quick responses to any of our questions and comments? Just very quickly.
Thanks. All questions relevant. Again, the big elephant in the room is Trump. The Republicans, you know, the logo is the elephant. And that elephant, we thought in his first term that Trump was a moment, but now it's clear that this Trumpism is a movement. And it's up to the global south to begin to live with it. It's a new reality. Apparently a lot of the scholars and the top scholars have, like, this rise of nationalism is a real movement. It's structural. It's in the US. It's also now in Europe. There are the right nationalist parties in most mainstream European nations that are 30% now of the voting stock. So this is a movement. And it's very important to understand, as had happened in the 30s, why? Why are these movements mushrooming? India as well. And a lot of authoritarianism is growing in kind of global south countries. And so the media or reporters need to begin to understand that story. It's basically the return of the nation state, or what is called identity politics, as back on the nation state. And South Africa is an interesting case study. AfriForum has more kind of advocacy impact than I think any majority institution in this country. Why so? What are the power relations? What explains these dynamics? Why are the advocacy or media strategies more effective than, let's say, majoritarian kind of majority institutions? And why has the majority or progressive dropped the ball? We had 30 years of democracy. All the spaces were open. Why have the progressives dropped the ball? We ourselves should take critical stock taking. The right is very well organized, and they use it because it's not only a resource question. They're really committed to their cause. If you study as a scholar, the right is always committed to their cause. I mean, they work 24/7. The left, they'll work 9 to 5 and then they'll go to the pub and relax. Whereas the right, they work overtime. And they even work on Sundays in the churches and the religious institutions. And that's why they're so powerful. If you look at the US, why the right has done so well in elections or any other advocacy issue, is because they work overtime on the issue. It's almost a calling from God, and they really take it seriously. And I think the progressives have kind of taken it very easy over the years, and it's a wake-up call. Democratic spaces are not going to be there forever. And it's a very dystopian statement, but it's real. It's happening. You ask colleagues, you speak in India, 15 years ago, they were very relaxed. Democracy is there. We've got institutions. And then comes a whole right-wing movement, and they take over the state and policy. And today, you cannot even say one word against the president. You'll get jailed. That's in India. Fortunately, in South Africa, we can criticize the president. He may not come to your press conference. That's okay. But he's not going to jail you if you say something critical of him. So we're actually quite lucky there. But is that going to last forever? So we got to think forward and work together despite there's a lot of differences in civil society. And you got to find a common agenda and say, okay, we agree on these and let's go forward. Areas you disagree on, then kind of put it on the back burner. But work on the common issues, because that's more important than the kind of differences. And I think there's lessons to be learned from the US and India examples of civil society.
Wonderful. So thank you so much to our incredible panelists. I think we're going to close there. Did you want to say something else? No. I'm going to censor you. So, okay, let's close it there. Thank you very much for that insightful discussion. I think we could have carried on for a bit longer, really, if we had more time. So I think we can all take away that the G20 is not just an acronym, and though not a formal structure, it is a mirror of how global cooperation, power, and priorities are distributed. And I think our takeaway is that we need to engage the public and share the outcomes of these discussions. And the media needs to be more critical, we've heard that today, and push for accountability from our leaders. And I think when necessary, we need to think about if the G20 is not the right forum or the appropriate forum for some of these issues, then we need to imagine and build our own alternatives as Africans and the Global South. So thank you, everybody, for today.
You can announce it, but I'll just hand over the post. Okay, let's take a picture. Okay, okay. MC should. You announce it. Hey, now this is, at least we're not journalists, we can accept gifts. Oh, okay.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
I'll just give the post. As long as you see, UNESCO said as long as you distribute it, they were happy.
Yeah, but announce it. It's an important thing.
Okay. Have you got the post? You've got the poster on you?
I do have one in my bag.
Just a quick announcement. Several media partners, UNESCO, IGD, and others, we've launched a publication called UNESCO Media Sustainability Guide. And there's flyers out which we'll distribute over lunch. There's a QR code on the flyers, and that will give you access to the publication guide. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, thank you, everyone. We now break for lunch. From now until 2. At 2, we've got our workshop on from myths to hate busting, some practical strategies on identifying and acting against hate speech. And then we'll have another little break, and then we'll move into our Rate the Hate game, and that's going to be fantastic. Right, so there should be lunch just outside, or you'll be guided. No? Okay, lunch is in the main building, second floor. You will be guided there by ushers, I understand. Thank you very much.